This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzahon, and today I'm bringing you a bonus video with my What I Got Wrong video for Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. In this video I'm going to look back at how I rated cards during my Neon Dynasty set review and talk about cards that I ended up being significantly wrong about. I of course do my set reviews before actually playing with the cards, since the goal is to get it out there to get you ready for your pre-releases and such, so I will inevitably be wrong about some things, since it's impossible to get everything right before the set is actually released. Because new Capenna season is right around the corner, I thought it would be a good time to take a look at what I got wrong in my Neon Dynasty set review. Alright, let's get started. First up, there's Ancestral Katana, which I gave a C+ to. That's a grade that means this is a card you end up running like one of in all of your white decks, and it's a pretty nice card to have. And in my set review, I compared it to Pirate's Cutlass, a card from Ixalan that was incredibly good. I did specifically say it's not nearly as good as that card, but I did think it was going to get a little closer to being as good as the Cutlass, which was like a B+, and it just didn't get there. Part of the reason is that the red-white deck was one of the less good ones, you know, on average. You did have decks that could make it work, that could do the Samurai Warrior attack alone thing well, but even in those decks, like, Katana wasn't really one of the payoffs you were really counting on to help you get there with your attack alone stuff. You wanted the one that let you tap things down or buffed your creatures and stuff like that more than you wanted Ancestral Katana. And in the end, you ended up not running it in that many white decks, and in fact, you ended up cutting it even from Samurai decks sometimes, so it ended up more as a C-. That means I overrated this card. That's something I don't do a ton of. There are a few examples of it on this video, but for the most part, I underrate cards when I'm wrong. Speaking of underrating cards, next up is Imperial Oath, a card I laughably gave a C- to. I just didn't feel like it did enough for the mana cost. It just sort of felt, you know, we get these sort of expensive ways to make creature tokens in a lot of sets, and they're just not that exciting most of the time. You know, a C- means the card's fine. You'll play it in some of your white decks, but you don't play it that often. You cut it a lot, and you shouldn't take it early. But in the end, this ended up being one of the best commons in the set. And I think there are a few reasons for that. Part of it was that this format was kind of a slow one, and so you could do, you know, get to the 6 mana for the Oath pretty often. The other thing is, I think I just underestimated how good these tokens are with Vigilance, because you can simultaneously make this and have it stabilize you, while also giving you the ability to pressure your opponent, and that's a big deal. And then tacking Scry 3 on also makes a big difference. You cast this, you get 3 of them going, maybe you scry into another Imperial Oath, it's not out of the question, and it's really hard to lose the game if you cast this. You know, on 17 Lands, which is a website that has a bunch of data about, you know, how the cards performed in various limited formats, Imperial Oath drastically increases your win percentage when you cast it in a way that most commons just can't do. So it was a combination of the format being kind of slow and me underestimating these tokens that resulted in this card actually being like a B. You wanted to splash it in just about all your decks. It was easy to splash, which made it even better. It was just a very good card that I was very wrong about. Next up, there's Light Paws, Emperor's Voice. I gave this a B-, you know, which means, you know, it's not amazing, but you can first pick it sometimes. It'll give you some serious value, etc. But I overrated this card for sure. It was a lot harder than I expected to make aura things happen with it. Most of the auras you ended up running were like removal spell auras that you didn't want to stick on Light Paws in the first place. You could sometimes end up with decks that could utilize Light Paws, but not so often that you wanted to play it that much. Most of the time, it just ended up being a 2-mana 2/2 with minimal upside, and it was more like a D+, which means you usually didn't play it. Next up, it's Michiko's Reign of Truth. This is the first saga we're looking at. I underrated a bunch of sagas in this set. I thought they would all be pretty good, and I don't think I underrated like all of them or anything, but there are several that I did, and even though I thought they'd be pretty good, they ended up being even better, and Michiko's Reign of Truth is one of those. The big thing is, I sort of thought this card was going to need to be, you know, it wouldn't work that well in all decks, but it pretty much did. You know, all white decks had enough artifacts and enchantments that chapters 1 and 2 gave a significant boost, and then when Portrait of Michiko comes into play, she was pretty big. Oftentimes you didn't even get there because just casting it and getting chapter 1 and 2 was frequently enough to just let you win the game. I gave it a B- originally, which means it's a good card. When you first pick, one you should value highly, but it was more like a B+. It's an uncommon that was knocking on the door of bomb status. That's just how good it ended up being with all the artifacts and enchantments in this set, and how big of a theme that was for white in particular. Next up, we have another saga, Behold the Unspeakable. I thought this would be pretty good. I gave it a B, but I underrated it. Chapter 1, in the set review, I realized, Chapter 1 basically means you can take the time to get to Chapter 2 and you'll survive, which was what I really liked about the card. I knew you'd be able to draw a bunch of cards off of it. But I just underrated how big of an impact everything you get here is. I mean, the cards you draw off of this often win you the game. I mean, people jokingly called this card Behold the Unbeatable for a reason. If your opponent resolved this, most of the time, you just couldn't win the game. And it ended up being, I just mentioned Michiko's Reign of Truth was an uncommon knocking on the door of being a bomb. I think Behold just was a bomb. In fact, an A+. It just really increased your chances of winning the game by such a drastic amount that it ended up being one of the best cards in the entire set at any rarity. Basically, with all these sagas, I saw the amount of value you could get out of them, and I knew you were getting way more than your mana's worth, but I put a little too much weight on how much time they would all take to do their thing. It turned out you had plenty of time to wait for them, and that made a lot of these sagas better than they initially looked, and Behold the Unspeakable is one of those. Next up, it is Mobilizer Mech. This is another card I overrated. I gave it a B- originally. The blue-white vehicle deck really didn't pan out in this format. There just weren't enough good vehicles at common, especially, to make it work. And I envisioned Mobilizer Mech frequently, becoming crewed and then crewing another vehicle for you. And that situation just doesn't happen that much in the format, mostly because you end up with, like, 2 other vehicles in your deck at most in most situations, and guaranteeing that you're going to get this and one of those in play at the same time, it's not a great chance that that's going to happen. And in the end, it ended up just being a C. I mean, it's still an okay card. You're getting a decent card even with Crew 3, just because it's evasive and only costs 2 mana, but it's nothing special. Next up, it is Kami of Terrible Secrets. I thought this would be pretty good in the right deck. I gave it a D in your typical deck in the format and a C+ in a deck that could build around it. And in particular, I was talking about the black-white deck. That's the deck where you could most easily get artifacts and enchantments into play so that you could trigger the Into the Battlefield ability. But it ended up having a higher floor and a higher ceiling than I expected. It was more like a C- in your typical deck in the format and a B in the black-white deck. And, you ended up in decks outside of black-white even that would have like 5 or 6 enchantments and like 10 artifacts, and that was a perfectly good deck to play this in, even though it wouldn't quite reach that ceiling. It would trigger often enough that it was really good, and it just turned out to be a lot easier to get a 2-for-1 with this than I expected, so it ended up being one of the better commons in the set. Next, we've got another saga, Life of Toshiro Umazawa. This is one that I thought was going to be really good. I gave it a B. This is actually one that I took a lot of flack for giving a B to in the comments for the set review, where people thought it was just too slow and not good enough. But I did not underrate this. I mean, I did underrate this card. I did not overrate it in the end. So even I wasn't as high on this card as I should have been. Basically, with Chapter 1, you can pretty frequently snipe a creature. Then with Chapter 2, you either gain 2 life or buff a thing. And there are also situations where you just buff with Chapter 1 and 2. And that often just makes attacks happen for you didn't have before. And no matter what, you end up getting insane value. This thing costs 2 mana, and it gives you 2 good triggers, and then a 2/3 that has an ability. And in the end, this is another uncommon saga that I think reaches into, the lower range of bomb just because of how insanely efficient it is. And I think it became an A- in the format in the end, a card you first picked with regularity over rares and mythics in the format. Next up, we've got another saga, Okiba Reckoner Raid. I was relatively high on this one. I thought it was going to be one of Black's best commons. I gave it a C+ as a reflection of that. I saw, especially playing this on turn 1 and draining your opponent twice and then getting a 2/2 with Menace, seemed like a good deal. And the vehicle upside does come up, and I expected it to. But again, I underrated or put too much weight on how slow these were and not enough on how efficient they were. And so in the end, this ended up being maybe Black's best common, which is crazy because Black had a lot of really good commons in the format. But it ended up being great. It does stuff with ninjas. It's an enchantment. it just does a whole lot for only a single mana, and in the end, it was a B and not a C+. Next up, we've got Virus Beetle. We've seen cards like this many a time, Ravenous Rats type effects, 2-mana 1/1s that make your opponent discard a card. They're always kind of okay. They impact the game because they give you a body that adds to the board, and they also take away from your opponent's hand. And, sometimes they have waning value because in the late game, your opponent may not have anything to discard, but there were several things going on in this format that made this way better than the C- most Ravenous Rats-like creatures get. One of them is just that the format was grindy enough that your opponent having 0 cards in their hand didn't come up that often. People frequently still had cards in their hand even in the late game. And then the other thing is simply, well, a couple of other things. One of them is that it's an artifact, and that ended up mattering a lot. Basically, everything that was an artifact or an enchantment creature overperformed at least a little bit, and with Virus Beetle, it overperformed by a lot because it triggered all these artifact things. It was also great to sacrifice in the black-red deck. It just did a ton of work for you. And then it was also pretty good with ninjutsu because you could put it into play, attack with it. And if your opponent didn't block it, you could ninjutsu, put it back to your hand, play it again, and make your opponent discard again. And, getting it back from your graveyard was good. It just gave you a ton of value for the cost. And in the end, it's crazy, but the more I played this format, the more I liked Virus Beetle. In the end, I think it goes up a full letter grade and was a common that you could actually first pick sometimes. Again, black had a lot of really good commons. Moving into red now, our first one is a rare. It's Invoke Calamity. So the other 4 cards in the Invoke cycle, I think I did a pretty good job of grading. I knew they'd all be sort of hard to cast, but worth it if you could do it because they do such powerful things. Invoke Calamity, I did give the lowest grade of all 5 of them. I gave it a C+, but it ended up being substantially worse than that. This is, the mana is difficult, sure, but the biggest problem was just actually setting up Invoke Calamity. Not just your mana, but also needing to set up having 2 instants or sorceries in your graveyard with a total mana value of 6 or less. And you pretty much needed to have them in your graveyard. I realize you can do stuff from your hand with Invoke Calamity, but if you're doing that, you're using up a card just to get a discount. So you're sort of 2-for-1ing yourself. And that's really not worth it. Sure, it also makes sorcery speed things into instants. Also not worth it. You needed to be able to get 2 cards in your graveyard generally, and then cast Invoke Calamity to get the full value out of it. And you could do it sometimes, but part of the problem too is that this format had fewer instants and sorceries than most sets because they jammed in a bunch of artifacts and enchantments. And so just finding the things to cast with this, you could do it, but it hurt your deck more than it helped it. When you did manage to cast it, it felt great, but it was a dead card in your hand so often that I think in the end it ended up being unplayable and an F. Next up, we've got Kamano Faces Kakazan, yet another saga. This is one that I thought would be pretty nice. I gave it a C+. The thing that I didn't love about it was that I felt like as a late draw, it wasn't especially good because it would be hard to get anything out of Chapter 2, and then the 2/2 haste wouldn't be that great. And that did end up sort of holding true, but again, this is another one of these where I underrated how much value it gives you and how long it takes to give you the creature. I gave it a knock on its grade of a little too much because I thought it would be too slow, when in reality, if you cast this on turn 1, it was very difficult for you to lose games. You would, ping your opponent, and then you would play a 2-drop that got a counter on it, and then you'd get a 2/2 with haste, and that was insane. But even in the late game, again, you ended up having stuff in your hand that you could do. Chapter 2 still put a counter on something often enough, and a 2/2 ended up being relevant more than I expected, that overall this ended up being a B. Next up, it's Kenzin Smelter. I gave this as another card I gave a C+2 in the set review. I really felt like, it was going to be a nice sacrifice payoff for giving up artifacts, and that was true, but it ended up being even better than I expected. There were so many situations where using this just suddenly gave you lethal out of nowhere. So many situations where just getting this 3/1 and attacking with it was a huge deal. I mean, the token stays around, unlike most of these effects we're used to seeing. Obviously, it doesn't if your opponent kills it, but if you're able to make something into a token and attack them once with it, and then the next turn you get to do it again, and they sort of have to block, it ended up being pretty nice. It helped that there were, especially in the early game, not that many creatures that could block and survive the token. And overall, this ended up being a really great card, especially in black-red. And I think it was a B in the end rather than a C+. Moving to green now, I gave Bearer of Memory a D+. I sort of felt like it just being a 3-mana 3/2 and an enchantment wasn't enough, and I sort of felt like the ability wasn't going to come up very often, and I was wrong in most ways here. First of all, being an enchantment was just a huge deal. Like, I said about Virus Beetle, same is true about Bearer of Memory. Just being an enchantment creature is a big deal. There's so many payoffs for it. And the other thing is, this format ended up in these slow situations where you end up in a board stall, and that happened often enough that you ended up way more often than I ever expected being able to use Bearer of Memory's ability effectively, either as a mana sink or as sort of a combat trick that really gives your opponent a headache in combat. And overall, I think it ended up being perfectly solid as a playable, a C rather than a D+. Next up, there is Roaring Earth. This is one that I actually overrated. This kind of effect is really strong. Playing this early, putting counters on things every time you play a land, it's a big deal. But it ended up being a little more awkward than I expected. I gave it a B+, and I said maybe this is the best uncommon in the set. And it ended up being pretty good still, but it was nowhere near the best uncommon in the set. So I definitely overrated this card. I just envisioned situations where you would get plenty of counters out of this, and it would be great. Part of the problem, first of all, with the card was that you kind of, even though this format was slow, you needed to be actually adding to the board in the early game, and playing this on turn 2 could be a liability, especially if you didn't play a 1-drop. And so it kind of led to some slower starts that could end up putting you behind the 8-ball enough that you just couldn't recover. In the set review, I loved that if you draw it late, which is normally when a card like this isn't great, I love that you could channel it, and that did end up being good upside, but I basically didn't put enough thought into how bad this could be in some early game situations. You really needed to have a deck with a very good curve to consistently make use of Roaring Earth. Otherwise, like I said, you could end up in a bad situation if you didn't play something on turn 1 and you spend turn 2 casting this while your opponent's dropping like an Okiba Reckoner Raid and some random 2-mana 2/2. You end up way behind your opponent, and that was a problem. In the end, it was more like a B-, and I think some people will probably think I'm still too high on the card, but I do still think it gives you enough value over the course of a game. It really sort of feels like a Saga. The one problem it has is it doesn't ever become a creature like they do, but it does give you so much value for the cost that I still like the card a fair bit, but it definitely wasn't nearly as good as I expected. Next up, we've got Season of Renewal. So I gave this a D in your typical deck in the format and a C build-around grade, which means I didn't think you could use it in every green deck very effectively, but in the ones you could, it was fine. But it turned out you could pretty much use this in every one of the green decks. There were enough enchantments around that you just could. And the first copy of this ended up being just great. It was a great way to find the value you needed late to just help you win the game. And I think you value the first copy of this card pretty highly in all the green decks. I think it was more like a B-. It basically feels like a way better version of Divination most of the time, and that's a good card to have. Next up, there is Tamio's Safekeeping. We see cards like this all the time that grant either hexproof or indestructible, and they're usually duds because they're a little too situational, and it's not really the kind of card that you want to have in your deck because they're so situational. However, there's a few things going on here that make it this better than most versions of that we've seen. For one thing, it only costs a single mana. Lowering any effect to 1 mana suddenly makes it way better, and that was certainly the case here. We haven't really seen a 1 mana spell before that gives hexproof and indestructible, and that just ends up blanking so many things. It can even wreak havoc in combat, and for 1 mana, I mean, that's an amazing deal. And tacking on the 2 life ends up really mattering too. This just does a lot for a single mana, and you wanted the first copy of this in basically all your green decks. I still didn't think it was like great or you should take it highly, but that first copy was something that you were pretty happy with, and I gave it a D+ originally, and it was more like a C. Let's move into multicolored now, where we've got Hidetsugu Consumes All. So I was saying, I've said throughout this video, like basically all the sagas are good. That's true, except for this one, really. This one was kind of a dud, and I didn't think it was going to be very good in the set review. I gave it a C-, which means you probably play it a little more than you cut it, but it's close. But in the end, I think this ended up being something you didn't play way more often. And it's because Chapter 1 and 2 frequently did nothing. And, sagas can take a while, and as long as you're getting value out of them in the first 2 chapters, or at least one of those chapters, that was okay. But with Hidetsugu Consumes All, Chapters 1 and 2 do almost nothing like 90% of the time. And then the creature you get in the end, you know, it has a lot of text on it. It's a cool card, but it's not very good in limited. By the time it can attack, which at the earliest will be turn 6, it's not like this 3/3 is going to be able to gain very many counters, and it certainly won't ever be doing the alternate win effect for you either. And so in the end, I think this is just like a D-. I mean, it was probably more of a sideboard card than anything. You know, I mostly play best of one, and I guess most people do these days in general, so that didn't come up. But, you know, some opponents did have enough 1-drops that it could do a thing, but most didn't. And it was just not a very good card to play. And it has one of the worst win rates on 17 lands of any card in the set. Next up, there is Commie War. I knew this thing was great, but I was like, you know, the mana is intense, and while I knew in my set review and said in my set review, fixing is pretty good in this format, I didn't think it was going to be so good that you wanted to just slam this as a first pick most of the time. I still gave it a B+, which means it's great, and you should try really hard to play it, and it will win you the game most of the time when you cast it. But the mana value hurt it for me. But in the end, fixing ended up being even better in this set than I expected. And getting all 5 colors was pretty doable, especially if you were base green. And so I think you do first pick the Commie War most of the time when you see it. It's just not that hard to, you know, make a deck that it'll work in. And in the end, it was an A instead of a B+. Naomi, Pillar of Order, is next. In the set review, I said I thought she might be the worst of the Signpost Uncommons. I still gave her a C+, which is a respectable grade, but I thought it would be a little too difficult to just make it so you had enough artifacts and enchantments to get her going, and I felt like you really needed to get the 2/2 out of her when you cast her to make her useful. And I think that did end up being true. You needed to be able to get that first 2/2 and then another one out of her when you attacked with her. But that turned out to be easier than I expected. The black-white deck, you know, we already saw Kami of Terrible Secrets, a card I underrated similarly. It just turned out that like a bunch of your creatures were artifacts and a bunch of them were enchantments if you drafted black-white, even if you weren't really trying. And so triggering these things ended up being easier than I expected. And in the end, I thought she was one of the better Signpost Uncommons and more like a B. And the last card we're going to look at is Bronze Cudgels. I didn't think this was very good in my set review. I gave it a D+, but the thing that sort of saved it from being entirely unplayable for me was the fact that it only cost 1 in a set that cares about artifacts, and it can equip for 1 in a set that cares about modifications. But it turns out there were just so many better artifacts in this set that actually do stuff that you didn't really need to run the Cudgels, and the modification theme in the set was really underwhelming in the end. So this just ended up being unplayable. You know, pumping all this mana into it just to increase a creature's power just wasn't worth it, and it ended up being an F. Well, those are the cards I was wrong about in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that more people can enjoy it. If you want to make sure you stay aware of my future content, including my Streets of New Capenna set review in the not-too-distant future, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.